Hello, students. I thought that I would take this opportunity to offer several further thoughts about Meno's dialogue, Plato's Meno, and I hope that these can inspire further discussion on our discussion board. If you will recall, Meno's dialogue begins by Meno posing the question to Socrates, hoping to learn from Socrates, what is the nature of virtue? Socrates, in his usual fashion, assumes that he doesn't know, and immediately poses the question back to Meno and says, "I don't know what virtue is, but maybe together we can inquire into it, and maybe together we can find out." So Socrates asks Meno, what is virtue? And then, quite as a foil or a contrast to Socrates, Meno immediately has an answer. He says, "Oh, that's not even a difficult question." And he immediately proceeds to give a whole litany of different virtues, and he starts by saying, the virtue of a man, for instance, is to help his friends and to harm his enemies. And he says another virtue of a man is to be able to hold a political office, and etc. Not surprisingly, Socrates is unsatisfied with Meno's answers because, and he gives the reason that he's unsatisfied. He says, "Meno, I've asked you the nature of virtue. You've given me a list of virtues." And Socrates says, "It would be as though I had inquired into the nature of shape, and you said, roundness is a shape. No, excuse me. You said roundness is shape. It would be more correct to say roundness is a shape, right?" And so, in other words, Socrates is inquiring into the nature of virtue, and Meno has given him instances of virtue, but failed to address the nature of virtue. It doesn't take long before Meno becomes quite exasperated and even irritated by Socrates, and he compares Socrates to a stingray, and he says, "Socrates, you're like a stingray, and you leave your victims perplexed." And Socrates says, "Well, that might be so that I'm like a stingray, but if I'm like a stingray, I'm like the kind of stingray that also leaves myself perplexed. I'm like the kind of stingray that stings itself, because I don't know what virtue is either, and I was hoping that we could find out together." And then this is the point again. Meno is becoming frustrated, and so this is the point where he sort of poses a challenge to Socrates, and this has become known as Meno's paradox of knowledge. And Meno says, "If you don't know what virtue is, Socrates, how can you be sure that anything that I've said isn't true? Like, how can you argue with any answer that I've given you if you don't even know what virtue is yourself?" Socrates immediately recognizes what's at stake, because he says, "If that's true, Meno, then you're implying quite a lot, because that would mean that we really can't learn anything. Learning is impossible, in other words. We certainly can't learn anything we already know, because we already know it. But at the same time, we couldn't learn anything we don't already know, because for the reason that Meno mentioned, we wouldn't recognize the truth if we saw it." And so it's immediately quite a paradox. Socrates, though, he recognizes that, again, Plato is presenting he's presenting Socrates not in the form of listing propositions and axioms, but rather he's presenting Socrates in dialogue with other characters. So Socrates here has recognized that Meno is a little bit exasperated, to say the least, and so Socrates says, instead of continuing with the argument, he offers a myth. He says, "Imagine that one time, or originally, that our souls knew everything. In other words, there was nothing they didn't know." He says, "Imagine that was the original condition, and then imagine that we forgot everything that we once knew." He says, then to learn something is a sort of unforgetting. It's an anamnesis, he calls it. He says that would explain how well, that's a solution to the paradox that you posed. And now, on the one hand, that answer might seem completely fantastical, or at least baseless at the very least. Like, why should we imagine that we once knew everything? And on the other hand, though, the more learning seems like something so straightforward, knowledge, but the more that we think about these apparently straightforward things, put in the terms of our course, the more we take these fundamental aspects of our life, fundamental elements of our lives, which we ordinarily think about naively. The moment we begin to think critically about them, at the same moment they suddenly become quite mysterious. And here's a quintessential example: is something so simple as learning. I invite us to consider, to think about this in terms of, like, what is the experience of learning something new? What is the feeling of insight, or when we say like aha? That has a certain there's something fundamentally mysterious about it. Because it's not the same thing. Learning something is not the same thing as just sort of gaining information. We know this. It's not just knowledge is not merely information. It's understanding information, right? So knowledge is understanding. If it were just information, anyone that was born since Google everyone would be basically omniscient. And we know that's not true, and we know that in fact almost the opposite might be true. In other words, Google might be making us stupider. And so, but on the other hand, we have to be able to. We have to be able to recognize truth in the information. So it's not just a question of information, obviously, but the truth has to come from somewhere. And so it's some sense of being confronted with information and then recognizing the truth in that information. And so this experience of recognition, it's not at all unlike recollection, like remembering something. And just think, like, we all know the Pythagorean theorem, for instance, but we had to, in some ways, it wasn't as though it's just there. I mean, it's there waiting for us in a sense, but we have to recollect it, right? And so, what if that same place, all knowledge is somehow not exactly hanging around there, but it's somehow accessible to us in that place? I think that's certainly how it feels. Learning something new or remembering something that you once learned, they're so similar, those feelings. And Socrates, in fact, he describes all knowledge as syngenous, and the idea is like it shares the same genesis. So all the things that we know, they spring from a common origin or a common source. And again, this is another thing that Socrates says that might seem strange at first, but the more that one sits with it, the more reasonable it starts to seem, actually. And we saw this fundamental relation of all of these most fundamental elements of our lives. We saw this in our discussion, in one of our first discussions when we talked about love. And we posed the question of whether all love is ultimately secretly a sort of self-interest, right? Like whether it's actually possible to love in a way that's not merely selfish. And we thought about it. We posed the question because it was suggested in our discussion that to give someone our love, that brings us pleasure. And so maybe it's the fact that the reason that we love someone is because we're actually seeking the pleasure that it might give us. Right? And if that's true, then we would say, despite that it might seem possible to love in a way that's not selfish. That in fact, we're ultimately, the reason that we love someone is secretly because it brings us pleasure. But on the other hand, we saw that it can only bring us pleasure. That it can only bring us pleasure because we love that person. We wouldn't receive pleasure loving someone. We wouldn't receive pleasure unless we first love that person. It's like in some ways we might be mistaking cause and effect. Like in fact, the pleasure can't cause the love, but rather the love has to, or the love has to come first before we would gain pleasure from it. We were exploring that question in our first, maybe our second discussion, and then we saw immediately that this question, it's totally impossible to answer that question unless you've answered 1,000 other questions, among which are what do we mean by self? What do we mean by altruism? What do we mean by love in the first place? What do we mean by pleasure? Right, and these kind of everything just sort of compounding and infinite circles of relation and ideal connections. And so then Socrates' idea that everything shares a common origin, that might not be so crazy at all. Maybe it does. Maybe it is possible to start from one thing and basically like ripples in a pool, and eventually they cover the whole surface. Think about it, something like a tree. I don't want to say a tree is simple or straightforward, but it's certainly something that we're all familiar with. And if you just think about the tree, you start from the tree, and you can think of, if I have knowledge of a tree, that means I also have knowledge of the leaves and the branches and the boughs and the trunk and then through. So that's kind of analytical knowledge, starting from the tree and going into the parts of the tree. But then at the same time, if I knew a tree, that I would also have to imply knowledge of the sun and the stars and the weather, the planets, the rain, water, the laws of physics, right? And then also through the seasons, I would have to. So that's in some ways through space, or conceptual space at least. But then also through time, I would have to. To understand a tree, to really know a tree with understanding. I would have to understand the whole genesis of the tree. And then generations of the tree too. All the seasons of the year, right? And so in some ways, it's the something that seems the craziest. The more that we think through it, maybe the less crazy that it sounds. I don't know. What I hope is that something that I've said can inspire further discussion and just. Amongst yourselves and also on our discussion board together. One thing that you might think of is anything that I've said in this video. How do you, maybe something that I've said seems totally incorrect, or maybe it doesn't. And the question is how can you tell how do you know the difference? How do you recognize what is correct and what is incorrect, what is true, what is untrue? Right? It's not just that you, and you can take me or take anyone, it's not just that you believe everything you hear, and it's also not that you just disbelieve everything you hear. There's some inner sense with which we're able to recognize the truth when we hear it, right? And so I hope that some of these ideas can again invite us to think critically about learning, and I hope they can inspire more discussion on our Blackboard forum. And so with that, I hope that this video finds each of you healthy and safe and sane in these extraordinary times. And I will conclude by wishing everyone the best, and farewell until next time.